They thought he was just another farmer, tucked away on quiet land, invisible enough to push aside. But when a powerful homeowners association decided his property was nothing more than an obstacle to their plans, the injustice they unleashed carried a weight they never saw coming. Because this man wasn't just defending fields of soil, he was carrying generations of struggle, dignity, and a truth about discrimination that cuts far deeper than land disputes. And the twist? He held a position that could turn their arrogance into their downfall. So the question is, how far would they go, and how much would he endure before justice had its say? For years, his farm stood as a quiet sanctuary, rows of crops stretching toward the horizon, barns weathered by time but strengthened by resilience. It wasn't just land, it was legacy. Passed down through generations, every acre carried a story of survival in a system that was never designed to protect families like his. Despite the obstacles, he rose above them all, building not only a life of dignity, but a career that placed him at the very center of aviation's highest authority. To the outside world, he was like any other farmer tending soil in silence. But beneath the surface, he was a man whose name carried weight in places far beyond his fields. That balance between quiet farmer and powerful director gave him both peace and purpose. Until the day the homeowners association decided his land stood in their way, they didn't see a man with deep roots. They didn't see a leader whose authority stretched across the skies. They only saw land they thought was theirs for the taking. What began as whispers in a boardroom would soon erupt into a battle that revealed just how far prejudice and arrogance could reach. At first, the signs were subtle. Letters slipped into his mailbox with cold, officious wording. Your fencing violates neighborhood standards. Your land obstructs community development. Each notice came wrapped in the language of legality, but the undertone was unmistakable. This is not yours. Not really. Not for someone like you. He had dealt with whispers of bias his entire life, but these weren't whispers. They were warnings thinly disguised as rules. The homeowners association insisted their vision was progress. They spoke of community needs, property value, and shared infrastructure. But underneath the polished language lay something uglier. The audacity to treat his land as disposable, his history as irrelevant, his identity as invisible. And soon their plans grew bolder. They unveiled blueprints for a private runway right through the heart of his farm, slicing across the fields that had fed his family for generations. It was no accident that they targeted him. He was one of the only black landowners in the area, and far too many on that board saw his success not as triumph, but as something that needed to be erased. He tried reasoning, attending their meetings, speaking with patience and fact. But his words were brushed aside, his presence made to feel unwelcome. Eyes rolled, smirks formed. And then came the real blow. Unauthorized crews appeared at the edge of his property, marking lines in the soil as if the land already belonged to them. Strangers maneuvered heavy equipment, ignoring boundaries, ignoring the farmer himself. He stood there, watching centuries of blood and sweat reduced to a construction site, and yet they still thought he was powerless, just a farmer with nothing but acres of dirt to his name. What they did not know, at least not yet, was that the man they tried to strip of dignity held a position of extraordinary influence. He was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, the very agency responsible for regulating every runway in the nation. But revealing that too soon would mean playing his best card before the time was right. So quietly he waited, documenting every trespass, every act of arrogance. With each fresh intrusion, the weight of injustice pressed harder against him. How much could one man take before silence became complicity in his own erasure? The land, the history, the insult. It was more than a personal attack. It was a reflection of something larger, a system where black ownership was still seen as conditional, where success invited resentment instead of respect. And as the HOA tightened its grip, the conflict teetered closer to an eruption that would shake everything they thought they controlled, because soon the man they dismissed would reveal exactly who he was. And when he did, their attempt to build a runway would become the very thing that grounded them in scandal. The day the HOA thought they had finally won began with bulldozers. Heavy machinery crept onto his fields as if invited, carving into the earth that had carried his family's past and his children's future. The roar of engines drowned out the silence of his farm, a silence built from decades of care, resilience, and ancestral memory. He stood at the edge of the field, helpless for a moment, watching strangers tear apart what generations had preserved. It wasn't just soil being ripped open. It was identity, dignity, history. He confronted them, demanding answers, demanding respect. Instead, he was dismissed, his voice spoken over, his presence treated as an inconvenience. To them, he was just another man they expected to fall in line with their dictates. Behind their smug expressions was certainty, certainty that power, influence, and money stood on their side. But what none of them grasped was that the man they were. Erasing was no ordinary landowner. When he finally revealed who he was, the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, the arrogance drained from their faces. The very people who presumed to dictate where runways could be built now stood exposed for trying to violate federal authority. Their actions weren't just unlawful. They were reckless, discriminatory, and humiliatingly short-sighted. And yet, for him, the reveal wasn't triumph. It was rage wrapped in restraint. Because it took power, immense institutional power, for his dignity to finally be recognized. Without his title, without his hidden shield of authority, would they have listened at all? How many other farmers, black farmers with no powerful title stitched to their name, had lost everything simply because others decided they didn't belong? The bulldozers went silent, but the echoes of that moment carried something far louder. A reminder that injustice only pauses when confronted, that arrogance only falters when unmasked. But this fight wasn't over, because exposing them was only the beginning. The bulldozers left, the blueprints were shelved, and for the first time the land stood quiet again. But the damage went far beyond the torn soil. For him, it wasn't victory, it was survival. Yes, his authority forced them to stop, but it shouldn't take a federal title to defend what generations had already earned. The lesson was as bitter as it was clear. The struggle wasn't just about land, it was about the right to exist without having that existence constantly questioned, diminished, or erased. The farm still stood, but so did the memory of being treated as disposable until power made him undeniable. That wound lingered. The reminder that in America, respect for black ownership too often comes with conditions, and equality is granted only when backed by status. His story illuminated a simple but harrowing truth. Countless others without prestige, without visibility, don't get to stop the bulldozers. They're left with silence, loss, and pain that rarely makes headlines. What happened on that farm wasn't just a skirmish over land. It was a mirror held up to a deeper system of arrogance and discrimination, one that threatens to erase contributions, identities, and histories the moment they're inconvenient. His fight ended with a pause. But the larger fight continues. The real question? How many more stories like his remain unseen? How many families will have their history paved over before we admit that racism doesn't always wear a hood or shout? From the shadows, it can also sit behind polished boardroom tables, holding blueprints and calling it progress. Because this story isn't just about farmland or runways. It's a warning, a reminder, and a call. The land may have been saved, but the struggle for justice is far from finished.